Hello and welcome to Flipping the Table. Today, Michael will be conversing with a large but interesting group of veterans of a monumental dialogue process that brought together representatives from agriculture associations, environmental organizations, and government agencies to find common ground between Aggies and enviros. Its success was amazing, as demonstrated by the fact that it lasted 20 years and resulted in an array of projects and innovations that helped shape current policies and programs at work in California. If you are one who would like to see a path past the conflicts and polarization that surrounds us today, we think you will like this conversation about the California Roundtable on Agriculture and Environment. Enjoy the show.
Hello. Today you're going to learn about an amazing project involving environmentalists and agriculturalists that lasted 20 years and included over 800 dialogues and meetings. It was called the California Roundtable on Agriculture and Environment, otherwise known as CRAE. It just had its closing celebration gathering in January, after ceasing operations. The CRAE was funded by Roots of Change before I became its executive director. But for about 18 months, I was the original facilitator of the CRAE process because the organization I was leading at that time, Ag Innovations Network, was hired to facilitate what was sure to be a contentious process. After I joined Roots of Change in 2006, we continued as the CRAE's funder for its first 5 years. But I actually got hired for the CRAE by its originator, Jonathan Kaplan, who was an organizer and an advocate for the Natural Resources Defense Council, known as NRDC. Jonathan hired me because I had been facilitating a similar process called the Ventura County Ag Futures Alliance, which brought farmers together with community activists. The enviros wanted to ban pesticides. Farm labor advocates wanted more protections for farm workers, and the Aggies wanted less conflict and more allies in their efforts to make a living in an increasingly regulated and urbanized environment. There was a gaggle of lawsuits underway between these sectors, resulting from what seemed like intractable conflict. The CRAE was facing a very similar dynamic, but at the statewide level here in California. So through this conversation, you will meet 6 participants of the CRAE process whose involvement spanned its 2 decades of work. 3 of my guests were from the pool of advocates representing a diverse set of interests. There is NRDC's Jonathan Kaplan, Gabrielle Ludwig, Director of Sustainability and Environmental Affairs for the Almond Board of California, and Tim York, CEO of the California Leafy Green Marketing Agreement. My other 3 guests are the facilitators who skillfully oriented the dialogues to ensure the CRAE would not blow up, but in fact would render meaningful results. They are Genevieve Taylor, Joseph McIntyre, and Katie Mauman. All worked for Ag Innovations Network while facilitating the CRAE. As you will hear from Jonathan, Gabrielle, and Tim, the facilitators were very good at what they did. We're doing this podcast in March 2025 because our world seems to be polarized to the point of societal breakdown, which threatens democracy as we have known it. But my 6 guests have experience that reveals a different story, perhaps even a path back to a sufficient level of cohesion to allow functional governments or governance of our nation, even among our very diverse and competing interests. So I've said enough to frame my conversation with 6 veterans from the California Roundtable on Agriculture and Environment, which they will be calling the CRAE. So let's begin. Welcome, everybody. Really glad to have you here to talk about the California Roundtable on Agriculture and the Environment. It's a rainy day here in California, and We're all over the place. Tim, you're down in Salinas, right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Jonathan, where are you?
San Francisco.
Okay.
Raining
Joseph,
here too.
yeah, raining there too. Good. Joseph, Katie, and Genevieve, where are you guys?
Sonoma County.
Sonoma County. Okay, I'll Sonoma County contingent. Gabrielle, where are you?
Washington, D.C.
You're in DC. Very cool. Wow. Okay. So we're a national group here today. So, why don't we jump in with this story of the 20-year life of the Cray? And I think we should begin with you, Jonathan, talking about, you're the guy that thought of this. What was your intention and what's the origin story for the California Roundtable on Ag and the Environment?
Yeah, well, we think I might have thought of it, but it was so long ago, no one can be sure who thought of it. But I'm willing to take at least partial credit. I think back in those days, I was at the Natural Resources Defense Council and trying to figure out how the Farm Bill worked. And it, dawned on me that we were spending billions of dollars funding individual farm conservation projects, and that there was a bigger opportunity, especially in California, where growers were struggling with ag waivers. We had, state water quality discharge regulations for the first time. And I had this idea that we could better use that money by focusing it on demonstration projects that would help groups of growers or watersheds band together and pioneer or demonstrate or measure best practices. And that if we could find common cause with agriculture, we could agree on how to better spend that money and everybody would win. That was the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of naive at the time because agriculture and environmental organizations didn't really agree on anything in those days. I think you wouldn't even find us in the same room together unless it was a courtroom or a hearing room.
So what did that lead to? I mean, what happened?
I met Karen Ross. Karen Ross was then the president of California Association of Wine Grape Growers. And she was probably one of the first agricultural leaders who seemed happy to talk to me, with my NRDC hat on, which was kind of amazing. And I think at some point I just pitched Karen this crazy idea, like, what if, could we actually get the cats and dogs to work together on this? And Karen, I think, said something like, yeah, that is a crazy idea, but let's try it. And she took the risk of inviting the state's leading farm organizations and environmental organizations to come sit down together to talk about it. So she put her name on the letter that went out to all these different organizations, because of course, had it been just me doing that, nobody would have responded. But they responded to Karen and they showed up. And we had the initial Cray meetings, 21 plus years ago.
Was there a series or was there one particular one that you had?
Well, that became the first of what I'm now told is 830 meetings. I still don't know how we got up to 830 meetings, but there were a lot of meetings that happened after that. And after the first meeting, it was not clear that there would ever be another meeting because I would say the first meeting was not a slam dunk or not a home run. I trotted out my Farm Bill proposal and it landed with a dull thud. It was, pretty much dead on arrival with that group. And, there wasn't a clear idea of what we could agree on, but I think that people were intrigued. There was sort of, like a morbid fascination to sit around the room and, see the other side at the table and not have something to fight about. And there was definitely a lot of crossed arms and icy smiles and not a lot of friendly body language. But at the end of the day, people seemed like they wanted to meet again just to see what would happen, even if the Farm Bill idea was a non-starter. So it's almost like, we don't have that much to lose and this is kind of different. Let's just do it one more time and see what happens. And that's, we needed to have expert facilitation, as you well know. And I think that's what made this all possible.
Yeah. So, well, let's go around the room then. Who, how did you each get invited to come to this thing, and why? That would be, what did you think it was going to be about? What would you get out of it? What would your organization like? So tell us who you represented and why you went. So Tim, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I was invited, I think it was before I knew Jonathan. So it was one of our a trade association representatives that was involved at Cray. And this is 2007 or so. And we were heavily involved in what we refer to as the spinach crisis in the industry when FDA put out a notice in 2006, don't eat spinach. And we were calling for strong food safety measures along with other buyers. We were the largest buyer for the food service sector, and we were using our influence and our voice to say we need a common food safety program. And that led to some concerns among the environmental partners of Cray about where maybe there were metrics or standards around food safety that went too far and had adverse effects on the environmental community or animals, habitat, whatever that they were trying to protect. And so I was invited to come in and be part of Cray and part of that conversation and lend a voice to it. It was interesting to come into that place at first, as Jonathan said, there's this morbid curiosity almost about what this group was like. And his organization and others were people that had been quite adversarial seemingly adversarial, I should say, with the agricultural community. And so it was really interesting to have these people sitting across the table and then trying to find, as Jonathan coined it, that common cause of where we had overlap and common interests. And this led to further work in that environmental work with one of our environmental partners. She and I worked closely on that, particularly here in the Salinas Valley. And that led to a white paper that Cray published in 2010 with food safety principles that still kept in mind sustainability or environmental protections at the same time.
So you thought there would be something to be gained. How about for you, Gabrielle?
Well,
And you represented who?
so I represented and I still represent the almond board or the almond industry of California. And I didn't join until, I'm not sure, 2010, 2011, somewhere in that range. But when I was looking back at emails, I realized that Chris Heinz, who had been managing the production research and the environmental committee, and she brought me in actually into the almond board, that she had actually been part of Cray earlier on. But I have to, when she moved on shortly after I joined, and so don't remember really hearing that much about it. But I think it was really more through Paul Butner that I heard more about it, and I was intrigued. But I just got an invitation, would you like to join? And I this sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and Paul was part of the rice industry.
Right, and Paul's with the rice industry. So, but we had gotten to talking, I can't remember how, and so someone had recommended that Cray reach out and see if I'd be interested in joining, because there was a gap between the last time Chris Heinz had been there and I joined. And I think from my perspective, it really was just curiosity is probably number one. And then, as others have mentioned, just that opportunity to hear different perspectives and ways in a unique way that I knew I wouldn't get anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So now, there's three. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. You want to say something?
And I think the other thing was just that sort of in this time frame, the almond industry was growing. So probably when we started, it was maybe in the top 10 crops in acreage and value. And more recently, it's been in the top 3 crops in acreage and value. So that's the other thing that probably contributed to the interest in having the almond industry participate, because we were larger, we fund research. People knew that we were engaged in trying to address some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. And so the three of you who have spoken so far were kind of representing the two sides of the coin, so to speak. But we have with us today the three people who were the facilitators of it for the longest periods of time. And so I just want to start with each of you. Like, when you came to it, what was your intention? What were you thinking about? Joseph, you want to start?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Michael. First of all, at the time I was working with Ag Innovations. Ultimately, I became the executive director of it. And, we we always felt, and I always personally felt, that there was a whole class of issues that my friends in the environmental community and my friends in the agricultural community absolutely could not solve on their own. That the balance of power between the two of them was too even. The issues were too complex, and the degree of communication between them was so low that the we were just going to be in a state of gridlock. And we were fortunate to have a number of leaders, both in the agricultural community and in the environmental community, who said, "Wait a minute, we could do better than this. Let's get together and talk about this as leaders." And it always starts small. The group started off with a win around, well, actually, maybe we could actually advocate together for something in the Farm Bill that would really benefit California. Huge win for the group. Just to prove the proof of concept that actually we've got things in common and we can do things in common. And then, of course, inevitably, because agriculture is uncertain, as is the environment, once you have that proof, then when something bad happens, like the spinach crisis, then we've begun to develop some relationships. And people have something that they can lean on in a moment of crisis. So for me, I was always there with an eye to three things. The first thing was to ensure that California retained agriculture in perpetuity. I think that was always where we came about. That was what our bottom line was. That two, that agriculture was sustainable, and we didn't have this term at the time, but regenerative was actually building California in a great way. And that three, that the members themselves were learning and growing how to be more effective leaders for the increasingly complex challenges they were going to face over the next decade.
Good, great. So I think Katie, you came in shortly after. I think after I left, really, actually, you came in. And so what were you entering with?
Yeah, I came on the facilitation team of CRE, I think in 2005, and quite young at that time. And for me, I want to speak kind of to the model of CRE, and that was, something I was really on the fence about. I had come out of a background around advocacy and economic, food economies, and very much like a systems and complexity nerd. I was really interested in systems theory and applying that to social change. And I think there are kind of two main branches of that. And so I'd kind of been raised up in one, which was more analytical, looking at the kind of structural issues underneath a lot of the challenges we see day to day, and then looking at how to address the root causes, and then advocating for that. And CRE was a systems change model that's quite different, right? It's more of like a social lab approach, or the theory is getting the system in the room, or representatives from across the system. Of course, you can never have the whole system in the room, but enough of diverse perspectives, and through a dialogue approach, really trying to understand the whole and the system dynamics in a different way. So my early days in CRE, I was a little skeptical, a little on the fence, but pretty quickly was won over with the power that happens when you bring diverse thinkers together as whole people in dialogue, trying to really listen to and understand each other.
Cool. Okay. Genevieve, then you entered. What year did you come into this?
I came in 2016, and CRE was pretty mature at that point. It had been together for about 12 years. So the format that I was guided to start with was to have the group scan the landscape once a year, identify together the issue or maybe a couple of issues that I was most interested in, and then really support them in taking a deep dive from a systems perspective to understand root causes, as Katie was saying, and then to identify ways that they could work together. So that looked like a lot of different things. Sometimes it resulted in a summit. Sometimes it resulted in a kind of a thought paper or a sign-on letter that usually had some careful thinking. There were joint presentations to agency leaders. There was even a couple of joint conversations where Ag and the Environment would go to an elected's office to help educate them about specific issues. So it really looked like a whole array of different aspects. I think the other thing to remember is that we went through the pandemic together. So Cray had always been face to face and occasionally met in subcommittees or with the steering committee online. And I think that was a really challenging moment for Cray because so much of Cray was about grappling with the issues that they couldn't solve alone. But also about the informal relationship building that happens when you're, sitting together in a small group and talking about the issues. There are so many moments that I know where people who were potentially arguing against each other outside of the room were able to talk about something different but related and to form different kinds of relationships together in Cray. And it was just harder to do that together. We pivoted. We did all of the things that, the good facilitators in that moment do. But we were so grateful to come back together in 2021. We met outside. I remember it was cold and a little rainy, and Secretary Ross came to join us. But that was just this joy-filled moment because people were so excited to see one another and to have conversations together. The other piece of maturity that was really interesting is the relationships were quite mature at that point. So it was the conversations that I experienced were more about tackling some of what they knew were shared problems, bringing up issues that they knew were going to be an issue that they'd have to talk to someone. I remember talking about compost regulations on farms, and we had all of the agencies there, and they were just in beginning of those thinking of kind of rethinking compost regulations. There's another one that was I think I heard land repurposing first in that room, and that was before the multi-benefit land repurposing program. So there's a lot of those kinds of hitting the desk before anything else because you were connecting together. And so those conversations were really important and stayed all the way to the very end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So I'd like to throw it back to the advocates that were in the room. We heard about compost. We heard that there were some agreements and letters and presentations. We heard about the spinach crisis and coming up with some guidance for growers so that they could both be safe for the consumers, but also treating the environment correctly. But what were some of the really meaty issues that you remember, Tim, and that you remember, Gabrielle, and that you remember, Jonathan, that were discussed? And I'll start with you, Jonathan.
We talked about all of them. Over the years, we covered it. We did all of them. There were many issues where we didn't agree, where there was no white paper or position statement or public briefing. We just hashed it out, revealed the perspectives, illuminated, showed where the pain areas were, and then decided, agreed to disagree and moved on.
Like what? Can you give me an example? Can you remember one 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's hard, but I know we must have talked about pesticides, for example, right? That's an issue that I was very focused on. NRDC wants to take away a lot of pesticides that farmers think are essential for their livelihoods, right? Pretty tough conflict. And there's a lot of, stereotyping, and I think both sides historically sort of came at this with the assumption that the other side did not have good intent. And when you really start unpacking the facts and the motives behind the facts, that's when you get into, some really interesting discussions, and you realize that there's a lot of good people around the room. Everybody's trying to do the best they can. They have their own constraints, their own needs, their own lines in the sand they can't cross. But, recognizing that a lot of these people, probably all of them, are trying to do the right thing from their perspective. Mm-hmm. And, I think for me, that was a big part of the meaning of the Cray experience, was appreciating that and getting to know the individuals and, enjoying them as people. Mm-hmm. Even Great. If I didn't agree with everything that they said.
Great.
I wanted to follow up on what Jonathan said, because one of the points that Joseph made in my early days at Cray still resonates with me. And that is, we in the room couldn't control what our larger organizations said or did. Jonathan could bring his best intents to have a healthy dialogue and exchange with those of us in the ag community, but he couldn't control the larger organization for whom he was working. So it came to the point where we really had to trust each other. And I think that was the really thing that was so critical and made Cray work, was this trust in each other, that when Jonathan said something, I believed him, that was his word was good, no matter what the rest of his organization or any other, speaking of an environmental community, any other thing they said, did, how they reacted, didn't undermine what Jonathan was trying to do in the room with us. And I think that was a really critical lesson that Joseph helped point out early in my days at Cray that still resonates with me in some of the work that I'm doing.
That's interesting. Thank you. Gabrielle.
Yes, sort of thinking about it. I mean, some area, I mean, I remember, Genevieve mentioned like having a summit. So we raised the issue that, hey, there's all these co-products out there, and can we find better ways of using them? So in case of almonds, the hulls and the shells and the woody biomass at the end of an orchard's lifespan. And again, it was something that I think some people hadn't thought about, but then when they started to really dig into it, it became aware that there were opportunities here that crossed the spectrum. And so that was one of those things that was just interesting to see. I also remember, like on water, we had some conversations about water and water supply. And to be honest with you, the first time I encountered a situation where, and this was not within Cray, this was an external speakers coming into Cray, where their version of reality had absolutely no relationship with my version of reality. Mm-hmm. And it was a shock to my system, to be honest with you, because I'm used to having differences of opinion, but realizing when your definition of what's real is so different, it is really hard to figure out how do you start a conversation in those situations.
Can you describe how you got past that, or did you? I mean, can you talk about water, what it led to?
I don't remember it actually leading to anything other than going, oh my God, because in this case, it was the state agency whose perspective was so out of line with what we were seeing and how we saw the world. And that's a hard one to figure out. How do you grapple with when the state agency itself has a very different definition of reality than, and this wasn't just ag versus non-ag, pretty much everybody else in the room. I remember looking across the room and a couple of us going, really? I mean, just this look. So that was an example of okay, how do you deal with this? And I mean, I think we politely asked questions and probed, but it wasn't easy.
Well, let me build off this, because I'd like to hear from the facilitators about this particular problem, because it goes back to what Katie said about the system, right? So you've got a government agency that's working on federal or state policies that are determined by the whole state or the whole nation, that are impinging upon the enviros and the Aggies in the room. What did you guys as facilitators do with those situations? Katie, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really, really sticky issue. And I think one of the first phases in the work when you're talking about an issue is building alignment, building a shared story about reality. And Gabrielle, I hear you speaking to an instance where that wasn't the case. But part of it is really, developing and building that through listening. So there's also this layer, which is kind of building leadership around collaborative leadership. Like, what does it mean to show up in a room full of people and be a leader? So there's like some capacity building around listening, standing in each other's shoes, suspending certainty, these kind of, muscles that we have to build in order to do this work together. But then really slowing down and doing learning journeys, or really, hearing from each other. What is your view of reality and what informs that? And here's my experience. And, with enough time, you can usually develop a shared view of reality. And that in itself tends to unlock really powerful ways forward that before that point weren't really accessible.
Mm-hmm. Great. Genevieve?
I think I may have been in the room with the situation that Gabrielle was just mentioning, but what I remember, not about that particular moment, but is that when we were talking about water, we started from a premise of identifying a shared commitment that without agriculture in California, environmental viability was also a challenge. And so this kind of shared commitment to agricultural and environmental beyond viability, but at the baseline viability. And from there, SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, came out in, I mean, before 2016, but we started to see the planning happening in 2016. And people became very concerned about that. And I think actually, we're seeing now some of the impacts of that. So having that shared commitment, the environmental sector knowing that it couldn't achieve its outcomes without thriving agriculture, and that agriculture knew that in that room there were others that wanted them in California. Because I think that has been a debate about ag's role in California, and how it I think it's been challenging at times to for ag to feel like it's welcome here in many ways. And also, I think there's been challenges on the environmental sector to say, like, well, you're welcome under these circumstances, but let's talk about what that means. And so they were able to have that kind of nuanced conversation, and from there could start to untangle, like, what does it take for ag viability? And we went from there into a shared letter on what were the priorities around both the water portfolio that DWR put out, and
Department of Water Resources, yeah.
thank you, exactly. And then also the 30 by 30 initiative that California was doing. And there was some very interesting.
Tell us what the 30 by 30 is, because people.
Yeah, so that's an effort to enable conservation to happen 30% of California's state lands, really, and I guess state and federal. Maybe you could correct me on that one, as well, by 2030. So it's intending to really meet this big target. And it was a federal initiative that Governor Newsom really signed up for. And there were many ways that they could do all the things that Governor Newsom was wanting to if they worked with ag as partners and continued to work with the environment. And so there was a series of about 5 different areas, which were pretty standard. Let's coordinate together. Let's talk to each other. Let's use what's already in place rather than creating new initiatives, those kinds of pieces that came out of that. I don't think any of that would have been possible without that fundamental and shared principle of needing agriculture to be in California in order for the rest of these outcomes to happen.
So the enviros needed the farms and the ranches in order to achieve their environmental goals. Joseph, can you throw some perspective on this? And also, where did the water conversation, which Gabrielle brought up, which I know is a tough one, there were some outcomes or some outgrowths from the CRAE around water, right?
Absolutely. First of all, the CRAE actually had decided at some point along the way that water was simply too big of an issue in and of itself to be handled within CRAE. And they actually asked us to go and form a new body that would look at it. And this was the California Roundtable on Water and Food Supply. And in putting that together, which is something that Ag Innovations did and Katie and I were the sort of lead on, what we were trying to do was to bring together individuals from important organizations who did understand water, but who were actual stakeholders, and to create the conditions to free them so that they could actually speak about the reality. And I'll give you an example. I can remember a particular meeting that we had at the California Roundtable after it had been going for a while, and they'd established a common language. They'd established what stewardship meant to everybody. But one of the members said to us, no matter how well I do my job, and this is a water manager, no matter how well I do it, how diligent I am going to get shot by my agricultural friends and shot by my environmental friends. I am absolutely in a no-win situation. Why was he in a no-win situation? Well, that's the interesting challenge that we face in California and across the world when there is a limited resource that has to be allocated across multiple important uses. Boy, that puts human beings at their worst. Right? Because naturally, we're all interested in protecting the thing that's closest to our heart, whether that's our fields and our farms and our livelihood, or that's our fish and our birds and our natural environment. It doesn't really matter to say that, that one person's heart is bigger or one's better or whatever. That's kind of like gets into crazy stuff. What we try to do in the California Roundtable on Water and Food Supply was actually acknowledge the scope of the dilemma and then provide some guidance about how to manage it along a sensible route, a moderate route, a middle ground, if you would, that really tried to find find a balance. Now, there's not a lot of tolerance for that approach these days, but back then I think we had some good luck, and that group particularly turned out 4 reports, I believe the number was, that were incredibly influential, widely distributed in the water world. So I think we really did some good things. And if I could take just another second, I want to shift it just a little bit to another example that really gives you why story is important for people to hear.
What story? The Cray story? Or
the Cray story.
Okay.
I want you guys to roll back, and I think Tim and Jonathan and Gabrielle, you will remember this if I remind you about this, because if you remember back in 2007, the light brown apple moth was discovered in California. And the light brown apple moth is an herbivore that eats a wide variety of plants and is particularly devastating if it gets established in agricultural areas. And it was established in the Santa Cruz area. And they were trying to do what we normally do with invasive pests, is eradicate it. And one of the ways that they were going to eradicate it was to spray a pheromone across the entirety of the urban population of the Santa Cruz area. Now you can imagine that was not well received by the population. Why did it come to us? Well, the Cray held a large-scale Cray meeting that involved advocates and stakeholders from the community, as well as from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, as well as our agricultural and environmentalist members, to hear the story on the ground from the people who are affected. And because that was conducted in front of the people at the California Department of Food and Agriculture who were making the decisions about how they were going to approach the process of managing light brown apple moth, and it was endorsed and supported by Cray, that conversation was very, 1, emotional, 2, intense, and 3, transformative, because it finally put into the room what was at stake. So again, remember, a lot of these conflicts have to do with, I'm trying to protect my livelihood. And if you have that on one hand, but you've got, I'm trying to protect my children on the other, right? You've got the situation where we can go into gridlock and fight each other in the courts forever and ever, or we can come up with better policy. Yeah. And what happened was the Cray recommended a better policy, which was ultimately adopted by CDFA.
Gabrielle,
So-
did you?
Yeah, I wanted to actually tie in with the water, and this is in some ways, Joseph just gave a nice story about how something went from this detail into the bigger picture. And I actually was going to say take water and talk about it more, going from the bigger picture into something specific. And that, as was mentioned earlier, one of the big benefits of being part of Cray was getting to know people from these different groups and gaining some trust. So one thing that happened for us was at a Cray meeting, someone from Sustainable Conservation reached out and said, hey, we want to talk to you about groundwater recharge. We can't quite figure out where almonds fit into this picture. So I said, okay, great, because they trusted to bring the question, and I invited them to come to one of our environmental committee meetings where we have growers and PCAs and so forth that decide how to fund some research. And so they got to ask the question. It was actually very funny because you had one grower go, I mean, literally like wrap his arms around, like, no, my babies, don't do it. And the grower next to him going, no problem. Well, the one guy was on heavier soil, the other guy was on sandy soil. That was the difference. But the outcome of it was that we funded research into to what extent can almonds handle this excess water to do groundwater recharge and when can it be done? And it's now, so we said, hey, we can contribute to being a small part of this larger solution because of the conversations in Cray and then the trust in Cray and then bringing it external to Cray to work on it. But I just wanted to give that as an example of something that to me was incredibly valuable because, again, in my job at the time, I linked into the research world. So part of it was saying, hey, there's this, and this going on. Where do we in almonds need to either figure out how to do something better from a growing perspective or develop data that might be relevant to these processes? And this was an example to me that came out of these conversations that went into a specific.
It's a very good example, Gabrielle, about how that works. And how, because groundwater recharge is so huge in our state, such a big issue. And the fact that one of the largest crops in the state can now be part of the solution is the kind of win-win that I think the California Roundtable or Cray was designed to do. Jonathan, do you have something you want to add on this? And then Tim.
No, I'm going back to the LBAM. I had forgotten all about that. And I remember, blood on the carpet at NRDC, like trying to persuade my colleagues to, I don't know to at least not condemn the LBAM sprayings. I can't remember where we ended up. Maybe somebody else on the call remembers what position NRDC ultimately took. But that was a really interesting one. And that was often my position, being an advocate, in an environmental organization that does a lot of litigation and regulatory advocacy, does not do a lot of facilitated group gatherings, right? That's not NRC's core strategy. So I sometimes had to explain what the hell I was doing with this Cray project to some of my colleagues, and I think they got it. And saw sort of like the long-term opportunities and the relationship building opportunities. But in the specific examples of the things we were discussing and trying to align on, sometimes it got a little hairy.
Yeah, I can imagine, because NRDC is really known as an organization that sues and wins. That's what it's about. So that's a interesting dilemma you were kind of in. Tim, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I think the LBAM is a good example of something that we didn't have a direct interest in, because my role was somewhat limited as a buyer of fruits and veg. I was interested in the viability of the agricultural industry, having a wide variety of products available to us out of California and grown safely from a food safety standpoint. So there were some issues that didn't directly affect me or my interest within Cray, but still the dialogue was interesting to be part of and hear this discussion and watch the interaction between each other. It was a great almost laboratory to see how collaboration really can work when you get good facilitation, people that come together with good intentions to find common ground, and then based on that common ground, look for how we move based on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. A couple of things you said, Tim, really stick out for me. One is what I think Joseph said at the beginning about the intention to create learning, a depth of learning and leadership. I think Katie mentioned that too, this idea of how do you become a leader in a place like that? The listening becomes so important, but also the data and the information you're gaining from the conversations, the dialogues deepens your ability to connect things and see the whole. So that seemed really interesting. And it also kind of links into this idea of this thing lasted over, 20 years. That is some evidence of success, because you were dealing with what they call wicked problems that are really hard to solve. And many of you have described what that means or how difficult it is. But this thing lasted 20 years. So I'd like to hear a little bit from each of the facilitators about why, how does that happen? Genevieve, you want to start?
Yeah. I actually think that some of the you said leadership and learning, that was a critical part. I also think genuine curiosity was a really important part. And Gabrielle, I have to praise you all over the place for the great questions that you asked in Cray again and again, including, as I remember, what's going on with the orchard recycling? And which led us, down a year and a half of thinking about understanding about biomass, cogen plants, and actually interacting with the task force on pine bark beetle infestations, which led to the wildfire task force, which is so pivotal for action in California now. I mean, we were in early stages at that point, and I will say, in terms of ripples, it also led to Ag Innovations and the California Water Action Collaborative really supporting and thinking through and understanding biomass and how to make a difference in the Sierra in ways that affected water and climate, and worked with corporations to help them find solutions that really could meet their goals while also supporting California's goals. So there were so many ripple effects that we saw for us, and those ripple effects, I think, came back again and again. We heard from another member that the work that we did on the Farm Bill made it possible for them to get, their local RCD funded in a way that they'd never been able to do before. And she's been one of our longest members, and I think it has to do with that, that success. So these successes that happened directly and indirectly out of Cray kept people coming back. And I remember another environmental member said, if we didn't have Cray, we'd have to do something like it. We'd have to get it going in another way, because it's the only way that some of these conversations are possible.
Okay, great. That's great. Katie.
Yeah, I just building on that. That makes me think, Genevieve, of kind of like the social field and the social innovation that as people come together, there's this sense making that happens, but also this innovation, right? These breakthroughs, these aha moments where you see things in a new way or new ideas come forward. So that's like the real fertile soil of a group like Cray that has almost like a magic to it sometimes. When it's really going well. Just another little layer that feels juicy to me is we would always start meetings with an information share, and it sounds very simple, but it's really just like what's bubbling up in the field. And it was really this no pressure, just sharing, what are we hearing? What are we learning about? What's important for us to know at the intersection of agriculture and the environment? And to me, that just felt so rich in terms of sense making or making sense of what's happening. And I that was a place where I saw a lot of members really light up, and some of these connections happened that then led to action, as issues were just emerging rather than kind of catching them at the tail end. So those were a couple of aspects that led me to feel, that kind of kept people coming back, because it's all, we also heard a lot of Cray members say, we really don't have spaces like this where we're not, with our heads down, like in a particular policy, but get a chance to look at the whole picture.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so the secret sauce seems to be this learning component that led to aha moments that enrich people's lives and their thinking, really, right? And also lead to solutions. So Joseph, what are your thoughts?
Well, I can tell you, I'm going to speak to it from a really simple way as a facilitator. I tried to make sure that every one of those meetings was fun, that there were three things in them always. There was an opportunity to network. That could have been through the information share, could have been the timing, that, whatever there was. There was an opportunity for real deep learning, and learning, whether that's a knowledge thing or a leadership development or a new systems tool. We brought a lot of ways for people to become even more effective in their jobs, and that there was action. There was something to be done. I also think that it mattered that the people who were in the room represented a group of people that would not get together otherwise. And so there was an opportunity here for you to learn something and be around people, even within the agricultural industry. or within the environmental community to hear from your colleagues about a different way of thinking about it. And so I think that those intersections, that kind of design, so that you're building more and more goodwill between the people, more and more skill, and you're connecting different parts of the communities that you're working with, the environmental community, the agricultural community, so that there's more cohesion as we develop these relationships. And Michael, I know you know this and have spoken before about this. As we build these relationships, the quality of the thinking increases. And when when those good thoughts start to come out, boy, you get that chain of reaction like Genevieve was talking about, where you went from woody biomass in the orchards to, oh my goodness, this applies to the entirety of the upslope of the Sierra Nevada mountains. That's the kind of innovation laboratory that we were trying to build, and I think that's why people kept coming back.
Good. Jonathan, you had your hand up. I'm sorry that I didn't get to you sooner. I didn't see
Oh
it
yeah,
sooner.
no, all good, all good. I'm wondering if this might be a good moment to like face the future for a second here. I mean, we've been talking about the past, what brought us together, why we stayed together, why we kept the conversation going. But I kind of feel like Cray has served as an important laboratory that the red state, blue state wars now need to learn from. And I think, we all know what happens when we get too comfortable living and working and communicating just within our own silo. It's very easy to start disrespecting, dismissing, ignoring the people who are in the other silo. And you start saying and doing things that offend them, that make the silo entrenchment even worse. And you might not even know you're doing it. And that just like feeds on itself. And I think we've seen, alarming levels of distrust and even hostility now among some of the same factions, certainly the same politically identified factions in other parts of the country. And when we started out at Cray, I think we had the same challenge. We had the same red state, blue state conflict right here in California. We just manifested it as, growers versus environmentalists, but they're very similar to these larger national factions that we see now. And, funny story, I'll just tell you what happened after our first Cray meeting that I think kind of embodies this. I got home after that first meeting and there was an email in my inbox that was sent to me by a leader of one of the ag organizations who I had just met that day. And the email said, "Alert, alert, NRDC has a new scheme to get onto our farms and ranches. They're calling it Farm Bill Demonstration Projects, but we won't be fooled." It was something alarmist like that, and it had taken what I had said out of context. And this person had accidentally sent the email to me, right? So they never would have done that to my face, but very easy to do when you're comfortable in your own community to send out messages like that. And, I then called this person up on the phone right after I got that email and said, "Hey, just got that email. Thanks for sharing it with me." And there was like silence on the phone. This person said something like, "Shit, you got me." And then we had this really honest conversation, maybe the most honest conversation I'd ever had with an ag leader, at that point in my career. And it just kind of like melted through the barriers, and we were just like two individuals having a real connection. And it made me really appreciate the barriers and the silos that are otherwise up and around me, most of the time. So anyway, I just, I think Cray made an important contribution, but maybe its greatest contribution could be in trying to inform what happens next in this country. And I don't know how or what that would look like, but I just feel like the core learning, the core appreciation that we've all gained on both sides of this, these two tribes, is exactly what the country needs right now.
Thank you, Jonathan. I do want to pursue that. I want to say one little thing in between before we move to that to see what other people think about your thesis here. I don't know if and part of your responses can be whether you agree with this hypothesis that I have. Because I remember before the Cray, when the first few years of Cray anyway, when A.G. Calamuro was the Secretary of Agriculture, and how often he was attacked for trying to do things by the agricultural community. It was pretty bloody. I heard things from different leaders of the ag community criticizing him many times. And after a few years of the Cray, and then when Karen came in, it wasn't that way anymore. And I have a feeling that the Cray was part of the reason that environment changed, that there was enough a kind of communication and trust building among the different parties that there was a different vibe, a different sense of how these policies could come forward. So under the Brown and Newsom administration, there have been a ton of policies that have been beneficial to both parties. The Healthy Soils Program, the SWEEP program, the compost program on dairies, the AMP program. So I'm just curious if you think that the Cray created an environment where, and other things that you've mentioned, that the examples of things that spun off and created new change. Did it create a different political environment? And that's how it relates to what Jonathan brought up.
Let me reflect a minute, Michael, on my evolution with Cray and some of the things that spawned from Cray in that evolution, because I first started working on the food safety component, right? And we had principles around co-management. And then I worked with one of our environmental partners on a report called Safe and Sustainable about that conflict within the Salinas Valley that was then published. And then one of Jonathan's colleagues was working on food waste, and we helped facilitate 2 days of going through fields and looking at waste that was left after harvest. And that led into work that I began doing with food banks, looking at the food waste. And then I was asked to speak at Feeding America's annual convention because I was one of the truth tellers about what was wrong with the food bank model and what wasn't working within Feeding America. And then that led to work that we did directly with the Arizona Diamondbacks and one of our companies down in Arizona, working with them. And there's still some work going on interacting with the healthcare community down there and looking at how we could prescribe fruits and vegetables as part of medicine, if you will. And that all came out of Cray and those relationships. And so each of those was built upon what we've used that word trust. Each of those was built upon trust with each partner along the way that said, here's somebody I can work with, and I know when he says this, it's genuine and sincere and he believes it. And I think that was really for me, that was the beauty of Cray, as all these other interesting projects that we got involved in. I didn't even mention the Stewardship Index that Jonathan and others and I worked on. So there's so many projects and interesting, I think, accomplishments came out of simply my sitting at the table with some of these people whom I would never have talked to otherwise, sitting around that table and meeting them and realizing we've got common interests and common goals here. And that to me was really the beauty of my personal experience at Cray. So I don't think I answered your question, but I just want to reflect on my personal experience, because that really was very rewarding for me, the work that I was able to do and the people that I was able to work with because of relationships built within Cray.
That's beautiful. That's great. Gabrielle, you want to say anything?
I think what Tim said was just really nice. I think having these opportunities to talk and hear, but with good facilitation. I mean, I cannot underestimate, I don't think we have said this from the members' side, is that good facilitation makes a humongous difference in terms of building that trust and being able to hear. And I think that's the part that's really hard right now, is we do not have a lot of people who are trusted enough to even be in that facilitative role to help us have those conversations that need to happen. So I think the model is there. I mean, for example, I do think, for example, there's something called the water blueprint. I think they used similar models of trying to bring different stakeholders to the table to talk about some very specific issues and move them forward. So I do think that we've seen some of this happen. I'm not sure at the moment how hopeful I am, but that's a different story. That has nothing to do with Cray per se. But I definitely think that I've seen some of these models go elsewhere, but I do want to emphasize it, having facilitators who know enough to push. I can remember Joseph at many times sort of looking at us and so asking some pointed questions that forced us all to go, you know, and that was really helpful because it got us out of our little boxes sometimes, or made us think about something that we had not wanted to think about or had not thought about, in addition to hearing what everybody else said. So I think that's an element to it as well that was part of the success of the mix.
The secret
Yeah,
sauce.
I want to second that. I mean, I feel like for this group, for this context, we needed more than just neutral facilitation. We needed coercive facilitation. We needed facilitators who were going to like lock the doors and not let us leave until we agreed. It was almost like arbitration as much as facilitation. I feel like, somewhere in there. I'm not sure exactly what you call it, but definitely different than maybe traditional facilitation.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So go ahead.
I mean, Gabrielle, you were part of the transition, the kind of the middle years, the maturity years. And my experience when I came in was that because the relationships and conversations were much more mature, people tended to focus more on the things that they knew that they could get collective buy-in on. And it was harder. I mean, I looked for those conflicts and was always gave them space when we needed them. But folks maybe wanted to talk about them and then not move forward. I felt like that fell off some with over time. How do you think that how do we get to the pointed questions now in a moment when it feels sensitive? Like it's even more sensitive these days, and we don't all there are different shared realities. What are you seeing there that would help us, as a society, move forward better around asking the questions that matter most to each other?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the red and blue, I mean, I think if you start actually probing, I actually think there'd be quite a bit of agreement about what's not working for us as a society. How we want to solve that might be very different. But if you started there and just started to ask, I mean, this gets into politics, but when I was on a flight back to DC shortly before the inauguration, the guy next to me was looking at places, as a tourist. So I started talking to him at the end and I gave him some advice, and he was there for inauguration. And I remember saying something to the effect, I said, yeah, I can see that there's this need for change. I'm just not sure the person right now is the best person to do that, being very polite. And I think there's ways if we started to talk about how we feel. I mean, and that's something, like in Cray, we would have those conversations where, this land use, we're all struggling with it. We're coming at it from different perspectives, but we all feel like it's not right. So let's learn about it. Let's bring it up and start learning about it. But at least we started with, hey, we all feel like something's not right here. And can we start figuring out how to talk about it, how to learn enough about it to then figure out paths forward? So that's kind of for the moment, I think, where we are in our society right now is
Good.
Can we at least come to agreement about what we're frustrated with, what we'd like to see done differently, and then you can start talking about, well, how would you go about doing that?
That's interesting. Well, we're entering the last couple of minutes here, last few minutes. So let's go around. I'll start with Katie. Any kind of closing thoughts? You can refer to what Jonathan brought up. I'm curious what you think about what I said and what Gabrielle said and Tim said. Just sum up if you can and synthesize. That's what you're good at. One of the things you're good at. what you've heard and what you want listeners and those who view this to take away from this conversation.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. And I mean, one thing that's really rising to the surface for me is this dynamic in Cray that we're now seeing in wider society of grappling with difference. And I like what you said, Gabrielle, and it does seem that one of the principles in interest-based negotiation of going underneath people's positions to interests, and actually you can see what people care about and build connection off of that. And I think there's connection to be had off of, aligning around what's not working too. But I think that there's a lot of hope for us as a society in coming back together and forming relationship. We're hearing through this conversation of the power of real relationships and authentic relationships. And of course, we're being pulled away from that by social media. And it's so easy to other, right? To cast blame and to have that ripple out really far and wide. And the degree to which we can be forming authentic relationship across difference, and that can be painful when it's across real difference, and so much is at stake and there's so much pain. But to me, it feels like that's an important way forward for us.
Yeah, I like that. That's I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. That's good. Thank you. Genevieve.
I would go back again to what Gabrielle was just saying about, and you can see the curiosity that I think was such an important component of the collaborative leadership that was in Cray, and that I see in Gabrielle. I also think side by side is courage to ask those questions. And I don't think you can actually, in these days, be curious without courage, because as others were saying, sometimes the hardest negotiations are with the folks that you're most comfortable with, your tribe or what have you. And it takes courage to actually be curious. And I really hope that we can continue to find ways to cultivate that these days.
Joseph.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to everybody for a wonderful conversation. Before every meeting of the Cray, I would remind myself of something. I would ask for help internally for me to be able to help this group to rise above the differences and distinctions that divide us, and to see what it is that unites us, what pulls us forward into the future that we care about and we want. And I personally would say to my friends in the food movement and the listeners to this podcast that we know how to do this. We have the social technology. We have the tools. We know that if you can get people who are willing to suspend the idea that they're perfectly informed, even for just a little bit, and to listen to new perspectives, that new ideas and new connections and new opportunities will come forward. And a lot of the best ideas that the food movement have brought forward, a lot of the innovation that's happened in that agricultural industry have all come from this same kind of method, if you would. It's curiosity. It's a willingness to challenge your assumptions. Now, obviously, if we are locked into our respective tribes, if we are only hearing a side of the story, whether that's the side of the story that's coming, quote, on the blue side or the red side or the purple side or whatever side, it is inevitable that we are not going to hear the whole story. And therefore, we are not going to come up with holistic solutions. And so I would say to my colleagues in the facilitation world, to my friends who participated in roundtables like this, do the work. Do the work on yourself. Do the work to understand the problems, and be willing to set aside the orthodoxy and embrace the possibility that there are new and better ways to do things.
Good. Tim, any closing thoughts?
As always, inspiring thoughts, Jonathan. Joseph, what made you such a brilliant facilitator and challenged us, and was such a rich experience for me. I think rather than the end of Cray, this really, as Jonathan has kind of said, this needs the beginning of a new CRAE. And I think it'd be really interesting to pull together interested parties to sit around a table and look for those common areas once again, because the landscape has changed a lot since 2005 when CRAE started, and find out where there are, again, common challenges and perhaps common ground that we could begin to work from as a demonstration to others, continuing demonstration to others about how collaboration really can work and drive change.
Well said. Thank you. Jonathan, you have the last word, my friend.
Well, we have some black belt level recappers in this group, so I'm not going to try to improve on that. But there is one thing that I just want to add to the pile, and that is that in our society, I'm not aware that there's really much space for the act of just meeting and listening. It's not something we really reward or practice or make room for as a society in either camp. If you're a lobbyist, you get hired to pass a bill or change a regulation. Nobody hires you to go hear what the other side is thinking and to get to know them and understand what they need. It's like it's just not part of our lexicon of paid for work. It's not work for most of us. And we have to figure out how to make space for that and keep that muscle strong, build that muscle and keep it strong. And I think even though it doesn't necessarily have a lot of short-term gains, as we've discussed for the last 90 minutes, it has all these cascading secondary benefits that are tangible, are real outcomes. But the work itself is a little fuzzy. It's a little touchy-feely. It's not what a lot of hardened, business leaders want to sign up for, or maybe they don't think of it as what they should be spending their time on. But that is our challenge and our opportunity.
Well said. I want to thank all of you very much for a rich conversation. I appreciate all of you are incredibly articulate, and we're very good at describing your experiences. So thank you very much.
Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.